Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the EUPATI Alumni HTA webinar. We will wait a few more minutes just to allow people to get into the webinar. Okay, I'm going to start. Others will join in a minute or a little bit later. So welcome everyone again, and welcome to the EUPATI Alumni HTA webinar. My name is EUnetHTA, and I'm the EUPATI Training Organization and Alumni Coordinator. And this afternoon, we are very lucky to have 4 HTA experts on our panel. And these panelists will be there to answer your questions. So some people send their questions beforehand, and those will be tackled during the Q&A session. But if you haven't sent yet a question, you can still do so. So how to do so? Please use the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen, or you can raise your hand. There's a little icon with a hand. Click on it, and then I will unmute you, and then you can ask your question live, whichever way you prefer. Please do not use the chat box for that, because we will not be able to monitor two boxes at the same time. I also want to tell you that the webinar is recorded and that we will be sending it to you, but this will not be accessible to people who are not alumni. So it's really an alumni webinar. And I think I've said everything. So without further ado, let's introduce our panelists. So we have this afternoon Karen Facey, Hervé Nabarette, Victoria Thomas, and Anne Willemsen. And Karen, why don't you introduce yourself first?
Hello, everybody. I've met many of you in EUPATI face-to-face meetings, and it's a great pleasure to be with you virtually. So my background is as a statistician, so I've been involved in clinical development in clinical trials. I was a statistical assessor in the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, that's the UK regulatory agency. And then for the past 21 years, I've been involved in health technology assessment. And I knew nothing about health technology assessment 21 years ago, but I learned everything I know from Denmark. I went to the Danish HTA school, and in Denmark, they say that health technology assessment is about the evaluation of new health interventions, thinking about clinical effectiveness, cost effectiveness, organizational issues, and patient aspects. And that has stayed with me for the past 21 years, that actually patient aspects should be at the center of how we evaluate new technologies. And I've tried to bring that thinking to the HTA community and discuss that and develop methods. And I'm really looking forward to this interaction with you and my fellow panelists this afternoon. So shall I hand over to who's next on my screen? Maybe over to Victoria.
Thank you, Karen.
Thanks, Karen. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Victoria Thomas. I'm Head of Public Involvement at NICE, and it's my job and the job of my team to put what Karen's been talking about into practice, to actually ensure that the voice of patients and the public is included in NICE's decision-making in relation to HTA, but also in relation to its broader portfolio in terms of clinical guidelines and our social care and public health work. Karen's got a year on me. I've been at NICE for 20 years as of 2 weeks ago, and have been working in the public involvement team that whole time and took over running the team in 2009. And NICE is, we will talk a bit about this later, we're in quite a unique position in the UK in relation to HTA, in that we're a single payer system, and there are obligations on that system in relation to our guidance, which we can discuss in more detail, which I think sets us quite apart. So from the get-go, NICE included patients and carers and the public in all of its decision making, and our HTA program was the first of those programs, and from day one we have taken account of the patient voice in all of our decision making, through individuals and through organisations. So it's a great pleasure to be with you this afternoon, and I look forward to our discussions. Shall I pass on to Anne, maybe?
Yes, please. Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you very much. So my name is Willemsen. I am Senior Project Manager at EUnetHTA, the European Network for Health Technology Assessment. I used to work for the Joint Action 3 that was hosted by ZIN, the Dutch National Healthcare Institute. And I worked full-time for EUnetHTA, so I do not know that much details about the Dutch HTA perspective, but I know a lot about the other perspectives in Europe and how we bring that together. And I really learned it's a challenge to get everyone on the same page, especially also when it comes to patient input. And for me, it's interesting because I studied health sciences, and there we learned, of course, about what HTA is, what the principle is, but it's about how do you do it and not how do you consider patient input. And as Karen said, it should be central. And so for me, also a whole new world opened at EUnetHTA. And I realized that right now, after I think 5 years, many agencies say, yes, we need to involve patients in our HTA, but they still don't dare to take it a step further. So how do you then prove you really listen to patients, and what does it bring? So that is really the next step for whatever the future brings, because I think this is really crucial. And also in a future collaboration on HTA, I think this is where we need to go. So I'm delighted to be here with you today, and I hope I can answer all your questions on that.
Thank you, Anne. And last but not least, Hervé Nabarette.
Hello, my name is Hervé. I work in a big patient group in France. I work in the public affairs department, and I am in charge of coordinating some HTA questions from the side of patient. For example, I work on the submission that we send to our HTA body in France. And from a more general point of view, we have some reflection about assessment and pricing, because we are also, for a part of our activity, a producer of drugs, because we have some research and development entities inside our group. But this is quite special because so this is not a patient role in this side. But for a part, it is, because we think about the level of price so that the drug can stay accessible for the patient.
Thank you, Hervé. And now I leave you, the panelists, to start answering the questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Ingrid and to the EUPATI colleagues for setting up this webinar. And what I should have said, of course, is that Anna, Victoria and I have all been involved in the EUPATI training, and we're incredibly grateful to Hervé, because Neil Bertelsen, who was with the cohort 4 group in the summer, was due to be here, but unfortunately due to family reasons was unable to attend today. So Hervé has stepped in at the last minute, but he has amazing experience because Hervé has actually set up the patient involvement at HAS before going into AFM Telethon. So we are delighted to have him with us. We know what you've all been through in EUPATI. We know that you've all worked really, really hard to learn about the life cycle of medicine's development, right through clinical development, regulation and HTA. So we're really pleased that you're prepared to spend this time with us today. We've got 5 questions which have been submitted in advance. But as we're talking, just type your questions in the Q&A box and I'll bring them in. I'll intersperse them with the questions I've got, depending on kind of the best timing for them. So the first question that's come in, we all know that health technology assessment is evidence-based, but it's meant to be informing policy decisions. So it's really informing national decisions or formulary decisions or reimbursement decisions about whether a medicine or a device or some other form of health intervention can be made available to patients, and perhaps what level of co-payment patients may need to pay. And that's the kind of theory. But the question we've had is, you know, can HTA really improve our health system performance? And particularly those that are based on kind of national insurance schemes. But what about other schemes as well? And Victoria, you mentioned that the National Health Service in England and the rest of the UK regions is a bit different. What's your feeling about how well HTA informs those policy decisions?
Well, I think, as I said before, we're in quite a unique position in that once we've made a decision about a medicine, a yes decision for want of a better description, there is a funding directive, which means that funding has to then be made available for that drug or device in the system. And there are no further negotiations at that point. Once we have approved a medicine for use, then the funding to use that medicine has to be made available by the system. So I think we're in quite a different position to most other insurance providers from that point of view. In terms of improving our health system, I'm absolutely convinced of this as a definite yes. When NICE was first set up in 1999, the UK, England, the UK, was very much, we had something that we called the postcode lottery, which basically meant where you lived in the country effectively determined what treatment you were eligible for. And the point of setting up an organisation like NICE at that time was to try and reduce that variation, was trying to standardise access to healthcare. And I think it's really succeeded in that effort, partly because we mandated the approval of those drugs to be made available in the system. It doesn't always work, that flow doesn't always work. But the fact that there's a principle there that if we have proved that a drug that it works and it's worth the money, then that drug should be made available to whoever would benefit from it. And I think that as a kind of quality improvement initiative is really, really powerful. The other thing that I think has been really powerful for an organisation like ours is that at the time we were established, there was some fairly serious scandals happening in the UK Health Service, and some of which were about people not listening to patients, not listening to parents, not listening to the people who were telling the people in charge that there were problems. And the reason that an organisation like NICE was also established was to make sure that those voices who could act as an early warning system, who had a different approach and understanding of what matters and what's important, that those voices should be part of the decision-making process. And we have stuck to that principle from our inception. And it's something I'm enormously proud to be part of, because I think there is something about improving things, the quality of things, not just from a kind of theoretical, academic, clinical perspective, but also improving things in terms of experience and values and preferences and all of those kind of messy, awkward, difficult things that actually lead to a better healthcare system. So I think that there's the very kind of high level policy thing that I think leads to quality improvement, but there's also a kind of philosophical and moral thing, which is about we have a better healthcare system as a consequence of hearing different voices more loudly and more systematically.
Thank you so much, Victoria. Anna, you're working within EUnetHTA. Have you got any views about this?
Yes, definitely. And I really want to echo what Victoria has been saying. I think HTA really contributes to improving the health systems because it ensures there's more equity in who has access to what. And maybe in smaller countries it's easier, but it also really depends on how your health system is set up. And in EUnetHTA, that really becomes clear. There are certain countries that have it more on the regional level rather than a national level. So it is not the same everywhere. But I think having that HTA there allows them to use the same advice to come to same or maybe different conclusions, but then with a good reason behind it. And I think that is really, really important. And what I also think is important from the HTA is, of course, so many products are coming to the market, but it doesn't always mean that product actually is better or would improve the health system. And with HTA, you just look at it a bit differently. It's not only about is it safe and does it work, but really about, okay, is it better than what we already have? Can we afford it? And for who is it better? Because that's also not always the same as it is for the people in the study population. So I think really looking at that really gives you that clear improvement to the healthcare systems. And I think especially if you combine that on a European collaboration, because as I see it, there is no need for every agency to assess the same evidence at the same time, but do that together, and that you end up with different conclusions, that is fine, because you may have a good rationale and a good argument for it, but at least look at it together. And I think that would be an additional benefit for it.
That's great. Thank you, Anna. And Hervé, just wondering if you want to add anything to this kind of policy discussion about whether HTA can really improve health system performance and delivery. Unmute, Hervé.
Yeah, perhaps we can add that there is another activity in HTA bodies, and sometimes the name is not HTA, but it can be something like health service research. And you have some studies about the concrete questions concerning access of patients to drugs or to different medical services. And this kind of studies also improve the functioning of the health system, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Hervé. And that's quite interesting because we think about HTA as that sort of evaluation process when a manufacturer submits evidence. But actually, HTA is a broader term which encompasses primary research as well. And we're seeing more discussion about primary health services research, HTA research, particularly I'm seeing at the moment in relation to digital health interventions. As we're seeing apps and things coming forward, there's a real call for evaluation of them within the health system. And some really interesting work coming out of Denmark, which is really saying, actually, we can't just use a standard HTA paradigm here. We need to be putting patient perspectives at the front of this, because if it's a small digital health app, it's unfair to expect it to sort of improve survival. But actually what it should be doing is help a patient manage their own condition. And so we need to think about how we measure those kind of outcomes. And I think that's going to be increasingly important as we think about self-management, etc., personalized care and everything else. And I can see a question in the box which actually relates to one which has already been submitted. So there was a half a question from one that was submitted was, can every EU member state have HTA? But then there's an alternative question in the Q&A box, which I think fits together, is what improvements do you think the EU agreement on HTA cooperation will bring? And this is obviously a question to start with for Anna.
Thank you very much. And I'm really glad that this question comes up, because it is important to understand and also critically think about, is it really true what we're doing here? And I often start by comparing it. What if you want to step over to a different energy supplier and you know your neighbor wants to do that too? And I'm just making that analog because it's easy to understand, and we all have been in such a situation. So I mean, if you and your entire street wants to go to a different energy supplier, it really does not make sense if you are listing all, I don't know, 6 or 7 suppliers you have and all the aspects you are looking for. I mean, it makes much more sense if only one person is doing that, because it could take you hours to really review it. So let's say you're looking at, is there a contact I can call, or is it only online? Is it green energy or not? And what is the price? Let's keep it simple for the moment. Then let's say I'm doing it for all our panelists here. I'm reviewing it and I have the results. Then it does not mean we all come to the same conclusion, because it may mean that Karen thinks it's really important to stick to green energy. It may be that Victoria says, well, I really want to call people because it's difficult for me to do it all online. And it may be that I say, well, I already have green energy, so it's important for me to stick there, but I also want a lower price. And then you are going to compare, and that's where you make the decision. So I think the answer is, yes, every EU country will have their own HTA department, but they do not, or should not do, let's phrase it that way, their own review of the evidence by themselves, but they should do that jointly, but then make the appraisal, the decision themselves, because it may be that you have a completely different patient population in your country, or you have much more money to spend. Completely different discussion, of course, because we want equity across the world where we can. Not always possible. So you may make a very different decision on that, or you have already different comparator drugs available. So that is where your own autonomy should count, because we should not make the decision maybe for poorer countries or the other way around. So that is where we need to stay separate, but the first part can be done jointly. And I think it's also important to keep in mind that many products are coming at the same time. So it's also a question about, can we keep doing it separately? I think not. And in addition, also more complex therapies are coming to the market. So does everyone have that expertise to assess it in that robust manner that we wanted to? I also don't think we have that. So it really makes sense to pool the expertise and make sure that person really understands what to do with it, also comes up with that good quality review, so that we all can make the decision based on the evidence that is there.
Thank you so much, Anna. I love that analogy with the choosing energy companies. That's very good, and showing how we each have different values, and our basic values determine what our next decision is, and that's why it can be different decisions in different member states based on the same common joint assessment. I mean, Hervé, I'm sure the patient groups have been following the development of the legislation for the cooperation on HTA within the EU. Does your organization, or do you personally have any views on this and whether it's a good thing or not?
Yes, for a patient group which is dedicated to rare diseases, the last argument given by Anne is quite important, because this is a question of the rarity of expertise. And indeed, we know that with the same results coming from the clinical trials, we can have different analysis of this data. So it was proven to be a problem. And the fact of having a unique analysis at the beginning of the process is a very good thing. I think that the European level thought about the respecting delays. There is a question of time, access to market, and but I am quite sure about the answer. The fact that it will not give additional delays in the whole process of assessment. But of course, this is important for patient groups and the question of access.
And I think, Hervé, you raise a very good point there, that I think when the joint assessments were first done several years ago now, probably in Joint Action 2, there was some delay between the marketing authorization and the joint assessment, and that was often after countries had made their pricing and reimbursement decisions. But now we've seen great progress, I think, in Joint Action 3, and the legislation itself is setting a time window. I can't remember exactly what those time windows are. I don't know whether you know, Anna, but it's really shortening that period, isn't it?
Yeah, it should really be within 2 weeks after the EPAR, so the European Public Assessment Report is available. And in Joint Action 3, we proved we can, sometimes even a bit quicker. And we also learned that that is roughly the phase where agencies will start their national assessment or appraisal. And we also have proof that in some cases, our EUnetHTA joint assessment really sped up patient access to the drug, because the national agency did not have to do their own assessment anymore, but could simply take our report and immediately start price negotiations.
And from my own experience, so I sit on the Scottish non-medicines HTA group, and we've used 2 EUnetHTA reports, and we've just taken the EUnetHTA report and said, here's the clinical effectiveness, and we've just looked at the organizational issues and the economic modeling, and that has certainly speeded up our process, and we found that incredibly helpful. So we've then been able to add in our own patient involvement at that sort of appraisal end. Victoria, obviously now the UK is not part of the EU, but there are other collaborative HTA efforts going on in the UK. Do you want to talk about anything about those?
Well, we're involved with something at the moment, which is I'm going to forget what the acronym stands for, but you can tell me. ILAP.
Integrated Licensing Adaptive Pathway.
Which is basically a way of trying to, in the absence of perhaps access to a European-wide system, it's a way of trying to get products to patients relatively early on in their development cycle, with the view to collecting appropriate data as they enter the marketplace. And there's something about spotting the innovation, there's something about spotting the product that actually might do, as Anna said earlier, have that improvement on current practice. What is this new product bringing to the system that we don't already have? Is it a tiny little kind of difference, or is it actually something really innovative and different? Is a different mode of delivery? Is it a different way of kind of, does the patient not have to go to hospital in order to take the intervention or whatever it is? So it's a way of trying to speed up that process early on, and to work collaboratively with the regulator, the HTA body, and with manufacturers as well, so that manufacturers are clear about what kind of evidence they need to be presenting in order to be able to have access to this pathway, this innovative licensing pathway. And part of the kind of commitment that that companies have to demonstrate as part of this innovation is how they have engaged with patients as part of their development process. And so this is an explicit ask of the regulator, the MHRA, the Medicines and Healthcare Regulatory Products Authority, and us as NICE and the Scottish Medicines Consortium, that we are expecting companies to be engaging with patients before they try and bring a product to market. And I think that's, for me, that's a massive step forward and really important, and sending a really important signal to the manufacturers. Karen, have I got that quite right?
Absolutely. And I think you're raising a really important element there for EUPATI fellows, because really when we started EUPATI kind of a decade ago, I guess, or somebody can correct me, but it was a long time ago, and we were really looking at the different succinct elements. So the industry and how they were developing, what the clinical development was, how the regulators were reviewing the evidence, and then what happened in HTA. And what we're seeing now is a really much more joined up approach over that life cycle. And it's not just about evidence generation, it's about that patient involvement as well. And I think that is absolutely key. And it's actually got really important kind of aspects, and shows how important the EUPATI course is to give that broad understanding of that whole life cycle. And I'd like to thank Richard, because he's posted the link there to the ILAP, and it's Innovative Licensing and Access Pathway, not adaptive. So that's late in the day for me. So thank you for that. And I'm going to move on to another question now, which relates perhaps to something Hervé said. Hervé, you were indicating there that AFM Telethon is focusing on rare disease. What do you see as the real challenges for HTA in terms of assessing rare disease treatments? And then I'll come in afterwards and talk about some of the research we've done to maybe overcome some of those issues.
Yeah, this is a huge question, because there are different levels, but concerning our diseases, for example, there is the fact that the evolution is not quick. For this, I work in the field of neuromuscular diseases, for example, Duchenne myopathy, and having the good outcomes to be able to do some good assessment is quite difficult, for example, because this is not easy to have good proof concerning the efficacy of a drug. You have to define very good design, methodological design. And for a lot of drugs which are interesting for us, the question of the proof and being able to give good proofs is a quite difficult one. And I think from a more general point of view, as a lot of patient group and a lot of countries also, we think a lot about what we call patient-related outcomes, because this is also true for early access, because these days we have some evolution of early access system in France, and the HTA body asks to patient group, can you help us to collect more data about the drug? And so the question of patient-related outcome is also a question which is on the which gives some discussion between HTA body and patient group at the early access step to enrich the assessment of the drug, and especially drugs on rare diseases.
Thank you, Hervé. So we've got that situation where in a rare disease, the population is obviously very small, so the clinical trials are small. But what we've seen increasingly is really exciting new scientific developments that are targeting the mechanism of action of rare diseases. And so getting accelerated regulatory authorization. But that means then that we're often seeing interim analysis of clinical trials or short duration of follow-up. And then the payers are faced, and the other thing we need to be honest about is a lot of the treatments for rare diseases are very high cost. So then they have to be showing very high value to be seen as being value for money. But we've got lots of gaps in the evidence, which we call uncertainties, and that creates the challenge for us evaluating the data. And we've been, I've been working with colleagues at the Bocconi University in Milan in a European Commission funded project called EUPATI to think about whether we need to alter our HTA systems to take account of rare diseases. What we've identified is actually we should alter the whole system, and then that would make it work for rare diseases. And our recommendations include things like we need to go beyond clinical and cost effectiveness and consider the other important domains like patient issues and organizational issues, and make sure that we systematically collect evidence on those elements. If we take something like the cell therapies, we know that for some of these therapies, they're only available in 1 or 2 centers in Europe. And we know that there have been big issues for you getting reimbursement across your systems. Actually, we need to understand those issues. But from a patient aspect as well, we need to understand the difference that some of these products are making in terms of patient life and patient benefit. Because as Hervé said, the issue with a rare disease is not just that it's a small population, but that we don't understand the disease well. Often it hasn't been very well studied. We don't have good information about how the disease naturally progresses. And so we need actually more information from registries, and I think patients have a really important role to play there. And so what we've said in our guidance is that we've identified the HTA bodies need to be, we originally called it a bit lenient, but flexible towards rare diseases to recognize that there will be a small evidence base, both for clinical and cost effectiveness, but that actually the value should be determined by clinicians and patients. They understand here, their expertise is so important. They have to kind of be clear about what the disease trajectory is and make sure that that's going into the economic model of benefit. And so we're promoting patient and clinical benefit throughout an HTA process in terms of scoping, in terms of assessing the evidence, in terms of determining the response. And now NICE does that really well, as do a couple of other organizations, but many other organizations only involve patients at the very end when all the results have been assessed and, you know, patients may be invited to make a submission. But actually we're saying this is so challenging. We need more interactive engagement in this process. And I can post the link to that. Hervé.
Yeah, just to add a point, because you raised an important point, which is the fact that some new drugs arrive to the market and to patients, for example, gene therapies. And this is a new challenge because the HTA body asks to the firm new data after 1 year, 5 years, 10 years after the authorization to be sure about the efficacy and about the safety. So you asked about challenges concerning rare diseases. This is one of the challenges because rare diseases are concerned by these new drugs, for example, gene therapies, and there are new challenges of assessment in the time and in the middle and long time.
Thanks, Hervé. That issue of the advanced therapeutic medicinal products being one-off treatments, which we have to pay very high price for upfront, but we don't know, we're paying in a sense for the benefit that will come in the future. And one of the best examples I've seen of this is Varetigene for inherited retinal disorder, where the Canadians identified that you're paying for the 98% of the benefits are beyond anything we have data for. So that's a huge issue for when you could be paying for benefits for other patients, which you can see immediately. And these are the kind of challenges that we need to debate societally. Victoria.
They're much more low-level anxieties, I think, than ones you've described now. But there are, for us, there's a couple of really key ones. One is a huge suspicion of the relationship between the patient organisations and the companies in rare diseases, whereas we have taken a very pragmatic approach to say there probably is only one company developing treatments in a particular condition, and there's a tiny patient population. Of course these people are going to talk to each other, of course they're going to work together, and we need to have that kind of adult expectation that there will be that relationship, and be really pragmatic about it. The other thing that we've come across recently with a couple of cases is that, and this is again why the patient perspective is so important, is that there have been assumptions made about the success of the current treatment that is available for people with rare diseases. And the committees have made assumptions about how good that is, and have made assumptions that it is better than the patients experience it being, if that makes sense. And so for the patients, this new treatment looks very different to what they're experiencing, because their experience of current care is really poor. But sometimes our committee's perceptions of that current treatment is actually it's better than it is. So there's something about this mismatch between what the patients actually experience in terms of care and what professionals expect their experience to be, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Anna, is there anything you want to add to this discussion?
I can relate to a lot of what has been said. We actually have done one joint assessment on such an ATMP. It was our number 17 assessment. It is published, so you can read all the details if you want to. But there we also had real difficulties in it's such a small patient population. It is in children. It is highly expensive. It is only in a couple of treatment centers across the world. So how do you deal with that? And in that report, I think the patient perspective really got quite a high impact, because we got answers from a couple of patient organizations on a standard questionnaire deck, and we had an interview with a parent of a diseased child. So we really could also capture that emotional perspective, and that is actually something I learned from all the EUPATI fellows, that we also really need to consider that emotional aspect there, and the psychological well-being. So I think that is something we captured in there, and also the assessors really nicely use the input to select also outcomes that were of relevance to patients, and that informed the scope of our assessment. So in that assessment, I really dare to say that it really captures what was important to the patients. However, I really do want to stress that that is not enough. I mean, agencies and countries need to make the decision for whatever drug it is. They need to make the decision on whether they will reimburse it. And for that, you also need to listen to the patients. And I think it's important what we do on a European level, that we have that patient input earlier, so that we really can make sure the assessment fits what is needed and what the perspective is. But thereafter, you also need to listen to the arguments. And one thing I want to add, and that captures maybe a bit the life cycle approach, I think it's also critical that when clinical trials are being developed, patients are also included. So at that stage, you can already capture what the patient relevant outcomes are. And I think we need to find a way maybe in HTAs that we can reinforce it, because unfortunately we still do very often see that there just is no information on PROs or on quality of life. And that is really limiting then what the assessment can say.
Victoria?
Sorry, I just wanted to come back on that point and to ask Anna a question actually, which is about whether EUnetHTA is looking at things like core outcome sets for particular disease areas, because there's a lot of patient involvement in developing core outcome sets, so that the same outcomes will be looked at whenever a trial is conducted. And I wondered if that was part of what you were looking at.
It is not something we necessarily say in our guidelines, but it may be something for the future. For us, the focus is more that the reports we make are usable by agencies. So what we do is we do we call it the PICO survey. So all agencies can comment on what the relevant patient population, well, intervention is quite clear then, comparators and outcomes are for them. And to that, we try to add the patient perspective where we can. So we come up with quite a broad set of outcomes. And I can imagine that the authors, they will be looking at core outcome sets because they also need to start somewhere. But yeah.
And I think this discussion relates well to the question that's at the top of the Q&A box at the moment, which was about, can we really measure the impact on lives of patients when there are still many clinical trials that don't involve patient-reported outcomes, and how does HTA deal with this? I think one of our whole work streams within the appraisal framework was to look at patient-reported outcomes, whether they were used in clinical trials and how they were assessed in HTA. We found that there were some what we call general patient-reported outcomes used and some disease-specific, but for rare diseases, of course, there may not be a specific one. They can be developed, like you may know about the Hercules project, which has developed a new patient-specific PRO for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. But often they are quantitative outcomes, so you tick boxes. And we often find that they do not demonstrate benefit within the time frame of a clinical trial. And so I think they are an important element, particularly more the disease-specific ones, but that actually we need other forms of what I would call patient input and patient-based evidence. So we need the information from patient groups, from really good surveys, which tell us what it's like to live with a condition. As Victoria said there, what is the real experience with the current standard of care? Because quite often that is very different to what's been happening in the clinical trials or what the clinicians are telling us. So we really need to have that experience data, and preferably we also need jolly good social science research as well, but that hardly ever happens and hardly anybody invests in it. But actually we should be, you know, searching for that evidence. So we need experience, evidence, perspectives and preferences. We need all of those things as well as patient-reported outcomes. But I'm an idealist, I know that. So I don't know whether anybody wants to add anything else onto that issue around patient-reported outcomes.
Just to say, I guess, and the other thing to add to your idealistic list is the involvement in the decision making about the reimbursement. It's all of those things. It's the evidence, it's the experience, but it's also the decision making, and the patient needs to be part of that process too.
Brilliant, thanks, Victoria. And I'm going to ask another question, but I'm going to ask the anonymous attendee to just clarify their question, because I don't know what SAS stands for. So if you could just, sorry, retype that, I will then bring in your question, because we actually have a really interesting question that was submitted before, which relates to something which is a real challenge for many countries. We talk about almost as though patient involvement in health technology assessment is standard. It is not. So the question is, what do we do when a system does not want to involve patients? Anna, you've probably had experience of this. You've been dealing with all sorts of EU member states who have very different views about patient involvement. How have you been able to persuade member states who are perhaps a little bit skeptical?
Yeah, I think I've been in a beautiful position of being in that voluntary European network where we all were working towards the same goal. So I sort of could impose it to people, and I just made them test what we developed. But it took us a few assessments before we could do so, because we also needed to really come up with, okay, but what do we do? What risks do we see, and how can we tackle it so that everyone is satisfied? So we ended up with an approach where we used the HTAi questionnaire as a basic survey in an open call, and then we ask people to summarize it. But I can't get everyone to go a step further. And so that really is something for the future, where we also need to basically impose it, let them feel how it works, let them see it's not scary, let them see it really brings benefit to the assessment, and then we'll get there. And I think that is the way to go, that we really need to show where it helps. Also show that patients are not asking for the impossible, but they really are just the people who have the experience. And if they were the patient, they also want to be heard. So they just need really to understand that. And I think also now with the COVID situation, I somewhere hope that brings the insight into that, because we all have an opinion about what governments did for us and to us and what to deal with that. And I really hope that brings the insight into, okay, it really can be helpful and we all have an opinion that should be heard.
Thank you very much, Anna. Hervé, I'm wondering if you want to comment on this, because you started patient involvement in HAS. And, do you want to reflect on, what were the kind of key opportunities that you linked into to kind of develop that patient involvement process?
Yes, I think this is also a question at the national level, because this is a question of lobbying for patient groups to increase their voice. And I think patient group have to think about who says what and to whom in the general system. I would say a kind of communication plan. Perhaps when you want to increase the voice of patient in a given country, and especially in HTA, there are two targets. There is the government and there is the HTA body, and there are different kind of arguments. There is the value of patient input, what EUPATI students have studied. But I think that from a more general point of view, there is a place of patient in decision-making process. And there is also the survey of what other countries already do. And in France, the political argument about the place of patient in different decision-making processes was strong for the last 20 years, because there was a trend of what we call democracy in health, and patients are now everywhere, in the hospital, in different public entities. And the last place to conquer is the pricing committee. And patients are organized to be in different places. And the argument about what other countries do is strong when you speak to an HTA body, because the HTA bodies are used to thinking about methodological aspects and are very interested in what other countries do. And sometimes they don't like to receive bad rankings if they do less than other countries concerning patient involvement. And finally, you can also think about what you say through either discussions or on social media concerning this kind of question. So I think that thinking about that with a kind of communication plan and a political way is also a part of the question.
Thank you, Hervé. And I think that issue of identifying higher level policy windows, policy opportunities to link into is absolutely key here. I'm going to whiz on because we've got quite a few questions coming in and we've got 10 minutes left. So there's a really interesting question here about AI. So I'm going to rephrase the question of, is health technology assessment ready to evaluate artificial intelligence? I can start because HTAi has today, I will leave the report for you, just issued a panel report of a panel session at conference, which was about evaluation of digital health technologies. And this includes AI, and it included presentations from Denmark and from NICE and from China, identifying that AI is complex and we can use traditional assessment methods which look at bias, uncertainties, etc. But that actually we do need to understand how far we need to evaluate the algorithms that underpin AI and consider issues like bias. But as I kind of said in an earlier remark, to also think about how we determine effectiveness of an algorithm. What does that mean? So I think this is an area that is really interesting, and one in which patients must be involved, and one in which where the whole issue around data privacy, data access, who's accessing data, all of those issues become important. And Hervé, I could see you put your hand up. Would you like to contribute to that?
Yeah, but this is a very complex topic. But I think that a part of the issue of this question is a question of transparency, being able to be transparent about the way the algorithm was built, how many patients, the different methods, because this is very important for people who are going to think about the assessment of this algorithm. And the question of total transparency, or the more the biggest as possibilities, is a part of this difficult issue.
That's great, thank you. There's a very specific question here. I'm not sure which we can answer. So NICE hopes to cut the time it is taking for patients to receive novel therapies and offer flexibility with cost effectiveness decisions. How are these changes being coordinated with other HTA bodies? Victoria, do you want to start? Or is the answer just that we're coordinating within the UK, but actually the UK is now separate from the EU?
Yeah, I mean, for me, this is a huge shift, I think, because several years ago we introduced what we call our end of life criteria, which essentially allowed us to weight more favorably essentially cancer therapeutics that were able to deliver an extension of life in people whose life expectancy was less than 2 years. At the time, that we received a lot of criticism, particularly from people in the chronic disease community, who said, actually, you're saying that cancer patients are more important than people with rheumatoid arthritis. You're actually saying that one group of patients matters more than another. So I think for us to have taken that end of life and turn it into a severity criterion, I think for me that change in the modifier is a huge step forward, and I'm really pleased that we're doing that. What impact that decision will have on other HTA bodies, I can't say, because I don't know if other methodologies use things like end of life criteria or other modifiers or other weighting. So Karen, you're probably in a better position to say more than me.
What I'm wondering if Anna could tell us is, in the legislation for the coordinated HTA assessments, there has been a sort of timetable put forward for the form of medicines that are being done first. I wonder if you want to share that, Anna.
I must admit, then I would really need to dive into that a bit further, but I believe it was first going to be indeed orphan drugs and then oncology drugs, and then over time expanded to something else. But I think that's also because we need to be able to set up the organization on products we know many agencies will start to assess. So I don't think it's necessarily based on the argument that Victoria said, but maybe I can briefly expand a little bit, because I know that some agencies have I can't pronounce the word. Now I know that I'm not English. So at least it means that it's somewhere similar to what you explained, Victoria. So that they say if it's a very severe disease, we just will allow the product to the market, and we will check in a time. So that also some agencies have conditional approval, somewhat similar. Some agencies say, well, if it's an orphan drug, you come to the market, we pay the price for the first year, and then we reassess. So I think agencies are building upon that a little bit, but it really depends per country and system that you have.
Thank you, Anna. And it is, I think, oncology and then orphans and then that. I've got more questions than we can handle in the next 5 minutes. I'm going to ask for rapid responses now. I'm not going to take the questions that are regulatory or data specific. There's a lot of EU development in the EU health data space and real world data. We'll need another webinar to talk about that. But there is a question about our outcome-based reimbursement models, the solution, particularly for rare diseases. I'll take a quick answer at that this is something we've particularly looked at. As you've identified there, if we've got limited evidence base, we have to make a decision. We can collect data. That would seem an obvious solution, but it has been challenging to do that. It's very resource intensive, but our recommendation is it should be done when we can be sure we can collect the data within a specified time frame to have a decision within 3 years or 5 years. and patient groups should be fully involved in that. So we recommend that there's a framework for that data collection, which is preferably signed off by leaders from patient groups alongside clinicians and industry and the HTA bodies. Let's move on then to the question from Charlotte, which says, what can we do if the local HTA only recruits patients from certain patient organizations who may not be actually patients? Is there anything we can do to influence HTA bodies in that way?
I think one of the things that we can do is what Anna was saying earlier, which is about modeling what other organizations do and demonstrating that actually if you invite a broad church of people to take part in your processes, you are going to get a broad and more youthful and broad and wide-ranging discussion. So I think it is about kind of demonstrating the effect of thinking outside of the kind of the usual suspects, and organizations like mine being better at kind of blowing our own trumpets about when we do that and when it's successful and what difference it makes. So there's something about that kind of there's something about, as Anna was saying earlier, about kind of obligating people to do something, the kind of stick side of thing, but there's also the kind of actually your product's going to be better at the end of the day if you have this more inclusive, more diverse approach. So it's about demonstrating effect, I think, through other agencies.
Absolutely.
You can also try to do some comparisons with other countries, because I think that such a way is, so to say, an ancient way. It was at the beginning of patient involvement, but now every countries are open to a lot of voices. The systems are open to facilitate the voice of patient group. I am quite surprised by this this question and this what has been said for this country.
Thank you. And I'm just going to ask Ingrid. Ingrid, have we got a sharp 6 o'clock cutoff?
No, we can still go on. I mean, it would be a pity to stop all those interesting discussions. So please go ahead. And I have someone who raised her hand here.
Yes, that's why I was asking. And
yeah.
Panelists, if you need to go, just drop off, because I apologize. We did say we would finish on time. Very poor chairing on my part. But I'm keen to hear from Sabrina Grigolo. If we will unmute you and you can...
She's unmuted.
Okay. I think Sabrina's unmuted now. While we're trying to get Sabrina unmuted, there was another question there from Dominique, who says, don't we need patients at the table during the HTA deliberation by only using questions and gathering information, not having at the table, we're missing something? I guess this may have been directed to Anna in relation to the EUnetHTA process.
Yeah, happy to respond. We actually did think about that, and when we started the patient task group and how should we set up the process for that, we came up with different approaches, and reviewing was one of them, but also having meetings with patients was one of them. At the time, we opted not to do that because we felt it was quite a burden for patients, also depending, of course, on which disease we were assessing. And we also did not want to have maybe any conflicts of interest coming up, or we also have sometimes meetings with the manufacturer there, and that can be quite intimidating. Plus, we also have a very tight time on EUnetHTA. So at that time, we opted to not have that there, but focus really on the service and also interviews where that is possible, because I think that combination is really really helpful for us. But I do strongly believe that when it comes also to making reimbursement decisions, I think that is also where the patient should be around the table, because that decision directly impacts them. And in our country, for example, in the Netherlands, it is possible to attend certain meetings so that you can also ask your questions and provide your perspective. And that really then has a direct influence in what the committee decides.
I think one thing I would add here is it sounds like we're kind of saying patients must be involved in everything and must be involved in the decision making. But actually, I'm going to put my HTA hat on now and say that actually we also need to be aware of conflicts of interest. So we need to hear patients' experience and perspectives, but in general, patients will be advocating for their condition to be treated. And that's why actually anybody who has an interest in the condition, whether a clinician, an industry member, or a patient, is generally kept out of the decision. So even if a member of a committee, a decision-making committee, has an interest, say, in cystic fibrosis, and a cystic fibrosis drug is being evaluated, they would not be allowed to vote or be involved in that discussion. And I think that's right, because what we have to do is make the best decision for our health system about how we use our limited resources for the best of all users of the health system. So we have to kind of focus on the medicine in front of us, but take account of that need of the whole health system. So I think we just need to kind of put that other balance to the fact that these are difficult decisions, and they can be greatly informed by really good and systematic patient involvement. And I'm wondering if we can get Sabrina to unmute now. Have we worked that out technically, Ingrid?
Allowed her to talk, and then the person has to unmute herself.
Okay.
And I promote her as a panelist, so there should not be any problem unless she has problem on her side.
I can see Sabrina is still showing as muted. Sabrina, I don't know whether you can chat to us if there's a problem, or type your question into the Q&A box. I'm sorry about this. We did think this was going to work. I think we're wrapping up now. I've cleared all the boxes. Thank you very much, Victoria. Really appreciate it.
Not at all. Any other questions, please feel free to contact me via Ingrid or other panelists. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you all very much indeed.
Yeah, it's been really good discussion.
Thank you,
so
Victoria.
much. I think we'll wrap up now. I would just like to say thank you. I would be interested, I don't know, Ingrid, whether you send a quick feedback, or people can write in the chat whether they found this useful. This was something we just kind of thought about after the last EUPATI session. It's the first time we've ever done anything like this, a sort of open conversation session. Was it useful? Was it boring? Did we chunter on? You know, what did you think? I'll hand back to Ingrid now.
Thank you, Karen. Just got a quick message from Sabrina. Her connection is not very good, and she just wanted to say that she would like to confirm an interest regarding the conflict of interest in the HTA. I'm just reading her chat. So thank you all for participating to our webinar and for this fruitful discussion. I hope everyone enjoyed, I mean, both panelists and fellows, and that the fellows learn new things. So thank you once again. And just to remind you that this has been recorded, and this will be uploaded and made accessible to all the fellows in the coming days. Thank you, everyone, and wishing you a nice evening. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.